an associate professor of economics at Bucknell University. Let me just start off by thanking the Socialist Reading Group for organizing this amazing session. I remember that it was, if I'm not mistaken, still early days within the COVID pandemic when I first had the opportunity to interact with this lovely group of students, and I'm extremely amazed by the lovely work that you guys have put in. And I wanted to thank you for firstly doing this amazing work that you're doing, and also for inviting me and giving me a chance to share some of my ideas about Marx and Marxian political economy. Just briefly, for those of you who don't know, I'm trained in both the mainstream or neoclassical, or what we call bourgeois economic theory, or neoclassical economics as it is called. I've studied economics all my adult life. This is the discipline in which I majored as an undergraduate student in economics and mathematics. Then I studied neoclassical or mainstream economics at the University of Warwick, and I finally did my PhD in Marxian political economy at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And one of the major drawbacks in my education as an undergraduate student and as a master's student at the University of Warwick was precisely the fact that Marxian economics, and Marx's Capital was never a part of the curriculum. So this was something that was problematic and had to be resolved in my own private hours. And as a matter of fact, not only was Marx and Marxian economics excluded from the syllabus, it was considered something that was invalid a priori. So that was the frustration that I felt with the economics education that I got, despite going to the best schools in Pakistan and elsewhere. And I first encountered Marx's Capital as an 18 or 19-year-old student in Lahore. And lo and behold, I'll be very honest with you, as soon as I opened this book, I understood absolutely nothing. And the reason for that is partially that Marx's, the translations that are available from German to English are, they leave a lot to be desired. And I'm not the only one who holds that particular view. Marx's comrade and co-author Friedrich Engels, in the preface to the English translation, says pretty much the same thing. And this issue is, the translation issue is always an issue. It's so serious that literally 5 days ago, Paul Reiter and his colleagues came up with a brand new English translation of Marx's Capital. So even in terms of understanding Capital, I just wanted to emphasize at the start of this session that it's an ongoing, it's a living project. Capital's translation, what it implies, and how we can use this conceptual arsenal remains an ongoing project. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of talk very, very briefly about all 4 sessions so that all of you have an understanding of what we're about to achieve in the next 4 sessions. And within that context, what we're about to do today in the next, hopefully, an hour or hour and a half is going to become even clearer. So I'm going to divide this short seminar series into 4 parts, the first of which is going to be held today, i.e. Marx's Life Project and Capital. And the aim of today's seminar, unfortunately, I can't see my slides anymore. The aim of today's seminar is going to be to basically discuss how Marx's Capital fits into his life's project, by which I understand that Marx is a historical figure born in 1818 and someone who died in 1883. And within the interim period, as you can expect as a individual growing up in society, any individual, me, you, everyone else, goes through a period of transformation and change. Any other view would be non-dialectical. So in other words, I'm going to try to explain how Marx's life evolved over the period of the, the middle to latter half of the 19th century. And the main idea that I'm going to try to focus on is that beyond 1848, which is the time when Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, and 1867, when Das Kapital's first volume was published. Interestingly, it was published on September 14th, 1867, which is exactly 157 years ago. And I'm going to also say something about how students must read Capital. So I'm not going to pretend that in 4 sessions I'll be able to explain the intricacies of this entire book. But my hope is that with these 4 sessions, it'll become, it's going to act as an entry point, and it's going to make it easier for you guys to read Capital, which is my major aim. So in today's lecture, I'm going to focus primarily on Marx's life and the preface to Marx's Capital. That's going to be session 1. Session 2, which is going to be held next Sunday, is a very provocative session that deals with the question of, hey guys, the question of how we must define capitalism. And here's the point. When anti-capitalist individuals or people who are interested in thinking about a system beyond capitalism, when they contemplate the issue, as you can understand as a dialectician or someone who's interested in dialectics, I'll say something about that as well. How you define something has an impact on how you define its opposite. So for example, as we will see next week, if we define capitalism as a system of free market enterprise, then it follows that a post-capitalist, or let's use the word, a negation of capitalism would imply a system of non-free markets or planning. Okay, that's one way of defining it. Another way of defining capitalism could be to define it as a system based on the private ownership of the means of production. That's a second way of defining it. Well, you're smart people. If we define capitalism as such, what does socialism look like? You guessed it. It looks like non-private property or public property. Okay? A third way of defining it could be to define it in terms of private versus state, or markets versus non-markets, etc., etc. I'm going to argue that once we understand the conceptual arsenal of Marx's Capital, we're going to arrive at a new and unique and nuanced understanding of capitalism as a system of surplus value appropriation by non-producing members of society. Surplus value appropriation. That's what we're going to do next week. In the third and fourth session, I'm going to dive straight into volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Capital. Because here's the point, guys. Most of the lectures that you may have attended or the videos that you may have seen online pretend that Marx's Capital consists of volume 1. Now, that is strictly speaking the wrong way of thinking about this project. Because here's the idea. Capital is a book that consists of 3 substantive theoretical volumes, known as volume 1, volume 2, and volume 3, and 3 historical volumes that walk the reader through the history of the concept. So let me do this again. Volume 1, 2, and 3 are theoretical volumes of Capital that deal with an analysis of how surplus value is produced in capitalism. That's going to be volume 1. How surplus value circulates in the entire system, volume 2, and how this entire process comes together at the macro and global scale to produce the outcomes, the grotesque inequality, the crises, the recessions and inflation, the poverty that we see at the macroeconomic scale via an analysis of the rate of profit in volume 3. So I'm going to devote sessions 3 and 4 to those precise questions, so that by the end of these 4 weeks, hopefully, to the best of my ability, if I'm able to communicate the broad idea of volume 1, 2, and 3, hopefully it's going to become a lot easier for you to understand the central argument as well as the politics latent in Marx's argument. So that's the plan as I see it. Just a note about terminologies, and this is going to be critical to everything else that I say. I want you to distinguish between Marxism versus Marxology. This is by no means my addiction. I didn't come up with this way of thinking about it. A man called Samir Amin, one of the greatest thinkers in Marxian political economy in the 20th century, and a founder of the world systems theoretical framework, wanted us, i.e. students of Marx, to be able to distinguish between Marxism, which is an active discipline, an area of inquiry that applies Marx's capital to contemporary political, economic, and cultural issues. This is exactly why Marxist research is an active area of research which takes place in lively peer-reviewed journals like Rethinking Marxism, the Review of Political Economy, the Review of Radical Political Economy, Capital and Class, Science and Society, and all the rest of it. To borrow an analogy, Marxology would be a bit like saying that for a physicist, for example, physics stops with Principia Mathematica written by Newton. That's Marxology. So Marxology is based on almost a scripture-like understanding of Marx, and it also assumes that there's no essential epistemological break or transformation in Marx's work or his body of thought between 1848, when the 30-year-old Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and the man who wrote Das Kapital in 1867. So I'm going to distinguish and invite you guys to, as creative thinkers and applicants of the dialectical method, to think about which trajectory you want to assume. In my case, I'm very clear that I'm with the first category, i.e. Marxism, and not a Marxologist. Okay, so without further ado, I want to dive straight into it. Who is this person called Karl Marx, and what were the historical circumstances during the time in which he lived? Yes, Utkarsh, I will talk about the dialectical method. Guys, can you keep the questions till the end so we can kind of, I promise we'll have a lot of time at the end. Huh? Okay, so Marx was a human being who lived between 1818 to 1883. And the way I'm going to present his life is to divide it into 3 distinct historical periods. He was born in 1818 and died in 1883. And between 1818 to 1848, that is the time when this young person grew up in German society in southwestern Germany, and leading up to all the crises that led him and his co-author Friedrich Engels to write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The defeat of the 1848 revolutions led Marx and Engels to rethink the project and to ask the very specific question, what went wrong? And between 1848 to 1867, Marx increasingly withdrew himself from active politics, whatever that means, and focused his attention increasingly on trying to resolve, at least to the best of his ability, the theoretical problems of the time. And this led to the publication of Capital Volume 1 on the 14th of September, 1867. Between 1867 to 1883, there were a number of changes taking place in Marx's work on other fronts as well. So not only was he thinking about, and by the way, Marx kept revising Capital till the end of his life, and this is something that Engels very clearly mentions in the preface to Capital as well. Now, volumes 2 and 3 were published posthumously after Marx's death, which is why they're not as entertaining in terms of the literary criticism that is reminiscent of volume 1, but they're very useful in terms of understanding the circulation of capital and how the system comes together as a whole. So volumes 2 and 3 were published by Engels, and he discusses a host of frustrations with Marx's writing being one of the problems, that only 2 people in the world could read Marx's writing. One of them was his friend Engels, and the other person was, of course, his lover and wife, Jenny. Okay, so Marx was born in Trier, which is the oldest city in the Roman Empire. It's Germany's oldest city. It lies in southwestern Germany at the border with Luxembourg on the banks of the Moselle River. And because of the unique geography of this place, there's a lot of vineyards in this place. And it's very, very famous for its wines and all the rest of it. Marx's father, Herschel, was a relatively prosperous, educated, middle-class person who owned several vineyards in the Moselle Valley. But there was a problem. He was Jewish. And for those of you who don't know, feudal society in the Middle Ages had ostracized the Jewish community. And lo and behold, the Jewish community was ostracized and persecuted community in this part of Germany. For those of you who don't know, Germany was not a unified country at this point in history. So the place where Marx was born in 1818 was known as the Free State of Prussia. The Free State of Prussia. Now, this is really interesting because if you study European history, you learn something really fascinating about the French Revolution, something that I'll keep returning to, and what happened thereafter. So between 1797, pay attention guys, this is very interesting, between 1797 to 1814, for a good 17 to 18 years, almost 2 decades, this part of southwestern Germany had fallen to the French revolutionaries. So quite literally, I'm going to exaggerate the story to make it entertaining. A revolution took place in France, and this revolution, the Napoleonic Code that followed from it eventually, began to spread to other parts of Europe. And the French revolutionaries, through a series of battles and conflicts that took place during this period, had taken over this area and had installed a democratic regime that allowed people, that gave people all the rights that were available to people as a result of the bourgeois democratic revolution. Okay? Now, this is interesting. Imagine the following. 4 years before Karl Marx is born, Prussia falls back to the Prussian state. Now think about it. For 2 decades, a French revolutionary bourgeois democratic code has been in place in this society. You guys know this, that once people have more rights, it's impossible or very difficult to go back to the old ways of authoritarian rule. Now here's what happened. Someone's mic needs to be muted, guys. Guys, please mute your mic so I can... Okay, thank you. So now, with the French Revolutionary Code being abolished in 1814, this society has a very unique kind of contradiction within the society. The Jews, once the Prussian state is reintroduced, lose the rights that they had access to as a result of being a part of France between 1797 to 1814. Okay, now keep that in mind. Marx's father litigates in the legal system and tries to argue, because he's an amazing lawyer, that Jewish people should have the right to retain the rights that they had won as a result of being a member of the French Union between 1797 to 1814. However, Herschel, Marx's father, loses the legal battle, but he is a person who's not willing to give up, so he decides to convert to German Lutheran Christianity, which is a far more acceptable community to the Prussian state at that time than the original community that Marx's family belonged to. So here's the interesting bit. Marx's father, now that he has thriving legal practice, he sets up a law firm in Prussia, and he starts practicing, and the practice begins to thrive. And some of you are like myself from a Pakistani or a South Asian background. You're going to appreciate this. When your dad does well, he wants you to continue the legacy. So Herschel was no different. He wanted Karl, as did Karl's mother, by the way. There's this famous joke, and it's true. The autobiographer Francis Wien records that years later, when Marx published Capital and became a reasonably famous intellectual, someone asked Marx's mother, "How do you feel about Karl's success?" And Marx's mother famously replied that if Karl had made a lot of capital instead of writing a lot about it, it would have been a lot better. So I'm sure that you guys can understand that disappointment. But here's what happened. Herschel sends his son to study law at one of the premier universities in Germany. Why? Obviously, he wants his son to run the law firm once he graduates. But Karl has different plans. He goes to university, tells Papa that I'm studying law just as you said, but as a matter of fact, he starts studying, believe it or not, ancient Greek philosophy. Let me do that again. Your father wants you to study law because he wants you to become a successful lawyer. You go to this expensive university and you start studying philosophy. A few semesters into the program, Marx's father, Herschel, receives a letter from the university informing him that your son is not taking or is not interested in law courses. He's actually taking courses in Epicurean philosophy. Epicurean philosophy. And as you can understand, Herschel gets a little upset. When he learns this fact, he writes a stern letter to Karl, and far from being embarrassed by what he's doing, Karl writes the following letter to his father. So let's read this letter from 19-year-old Karl Marx to his father. And imagine yourself, some of you are in this age bracket. So imagine writing this letter to your parents. Let's read this. He says, "History calls those men the greatest," this is to daddy, "who have ennobled themselves by working for the common good. Experience acclaims as happiest the man who has made the greatest number of people happy. Religion itself teaches us that the ideal being, whom all strive to copy, sacrificed himself for the sake of mankind, and who would dare to set at naught such judgments? If we have chosen the position in life in which we can most of all work for mankind, no burdens can bow us down, because they are sacrifices for the benefit of all. Then we shall experience no petty, limited, selfish joy, but our happiness will belong to the millions. Our deeds will live on quietly but perpetually at work, and over our ashes will be shed the hot tears of noble people. That is the passion that is going to remain with Marx for the rest of his life. Marx is going to become a revolutionary who seeks to not only understand the world, but to change it, and to change it, hopefully, for the good. This brings in the two major passions. Unfortunately, there's a lag with the slides. There's two affairs that Marx had throughout his life. The first one is with a woman that he met at a very young age. He was his childhood sweetheart, his best friend as Edgar's younger sister. By the way, Marx was a loner, so he didn't have many friends other than Friedrich Engels at the latter part of his life. There were only 11 mourners on his funeral. But Edgar was one of those kids that he remained friends with. And there's a lot of speculation on why that may be the case. My own view is that it has more to do with his sister, Edgar's sister, i.e. Jenny, and less to do with Edgar himself. But that's just my view. And the second love of Marx's life, and a lifelong love affair, was with the dead philosopher Hegel. And that's going to be a second theme as we begin to unravel the mysteries of capital. And I'm going to return to that in a moment. Now, here's something interesting that happened. To reiterate, Marx is a philosophy student. He graduates and then goes on to get a PhD in philosophy. His PhD dissertation is about Epicurean philosophy. Epicurus, for those of you who don't know, was one of the major dialectical Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece, who had first began to contemplate on the nature of opposing objects, the idea of duality in particular. And that's going to be something that is going to stay with Marx for the rest of his life. So I want you to pay attention, guys. Here's a philosopher with a PhD degree in philosophy, and in the 1840s, he becomes embroiled in political activity, because a wave of revolutionary changes is taking place in Europe at the time. What are those changes? Well, an old system is dying and a new system is being born. And as we learn from Gramsci years later, when the old is dying and the new cannot be born, a host of morbidities emerges in the interim period. So the decade 1840s was something like that. What was going on is something fascinating for historians. When you get the time, Google the term 1848 springtime of the people. To cut a long story short, in the year 1848, all across Europe, starting with Italy, but soon spreading to 50 other countries. And by the way, there was no coordination between these revolutionaries. Spontaneous revolutions began to emerge all across Europe, in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Germany, in Denmark, in the Netherlands. A coalition of the bourgeoisie, the even advanced or radical sections of the nobility and the landlords, workers, middle class intellectuals, etc., began to form a broad coalition around new possibilities, an anti-monarchy wave of revolutions that sought to bring an end to feudalism and usher humanity into capitalism along the lines of France, etc. That was the theme of the year 1848. Historians have rightly called it a springtime of the people, literally. Now you can imagine that for a young intellectual like Marx was about 29 or 30 years old in the year 1847 to 1848 when these changes were taking place. You can imagine that this was music to his ears. This was exactly what Marx wanted to see. Because remember, Marx all through his life was inspired by, and was madly in love with the majesty of the French Revolution. So he thought that this was that precise moment. No wonder then that when we read the Communist Manifesto by the 30-year-old Marx, it begins with the words, "A specter is haunting Europe." Today, when we read those words, we're like, this is probably an exaggeration. Are you serious? Are people genuinely, is the monarchy so terrified of a communist revolution? Well, in 1848, that's what Marx and Engels thought. However, the revolutions of 1848 failed. They failed in the precise sense that while a constitutional monarchy was established in Denmark, serfdom was abolished in Austria, the modern state of Netherlands in many forms was born. There were some lasting changes from that revolutionary wave, but the objective of achieving liberty, equality, and fraternity, i.e. the ideals of the French Revolution, in that precise sense, failed. Now, as you guys can understand, when a revolution fails, the leaders of the revolution have to face the consequences. Marx was a part of that movement, and one fine day, the German police knocks on his door. His wife, Jenny, is pregnant at the time, in her 7th or 8th month, and the German police has this letter which informs Marx and Jenny that you have 24 hours to leave this place, otherwise you'll have to face the consequences. So Marx and Jenny hop onto a train which takes them to France, where the French police is already waiting for them, and they're like, "We know you're a naughty individual, you're not welcome in France." From there, they go to Belgium, where the same happy fate awaits them. And finally, they settle as exiles in London, in England. England at the time took great pride in its political freedoms and its democratic freedoms, so it became this hub for exiles or failed revolutionaries who had participated in the revolution of 1848. So it became a very interesting place at that point in time, where at the Soho bar, you would have all kinds of revolutionaries, from anarchists to people who had borrowed the ideas of the French socialist Proudhon, all kinds of Hegelians. It was an interesting place. So imagine a bunch of nerds, a bunch of people who are interested in making progressive changes in the world, and they're all in the same place purely because of political and historical circumstances. So now, this is a moment in Marx's life when he meets a young man from Manchester who's also of German descent, and this is a gentleman who would earn the title of Marx's general. Of course, I'm talking about Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels had written this beautiful piece called The Conditions of the Working Class in England. Because Engels himself was a capitalist, he had a very deep and sophisticated understanding of how businesses work. And Engels introduces Marx to the lovely world of political economy, and their friendship begins to grow. And as a result of this friendship, for the first time in the 1840s, Marx begins to seriously study what he calls the discipline that's going to teach me how to understand the real world as it is. So here's what's happening, guys. A trained philosopher begins to study economics. And in 1844, Marx very seriously begins, because by the way, he didn't know English when he arrived in England, he learns the language and he begins to study the greatest economists of the time, his predecessors. He reads Adam Smith, he reads David Ricardo, Malthus, and all the rest of it. And these notes that he took at this point in time, his literature review, so to speak, would end up becoming the Grundrisse, as well as the theories of surplus value. Just a point to note in this. Okay, this is a lovely book, by the way, that examines the role of Jenny's love in the making of capital. Because as you will see, hopefully, in this session or in the next session, dialecticians do not reduce reality in an essentialist way to one or another fact. We believe in overdetermination, and what that simply means is that a host of determinants have to come together in order to produce an outcome. So thus, capital is as much a product of Marx's labor as it is a product of the love and care labor, as well as the intellectual labor after, because Marx used to resolve the problem, the theoretical problem, and he was a lazy individual sometimes. He would leave the paperwork lying here and there. So without the love and attention of Jenny, this work would have been impossible. Okay, let's now dive into, with that brief biographical note, I want to just emphasize one final point, that with the end of Marx's political work in 1848 to 1850, and the end of his romance with, because think about it, once Marx arrives in England, and imagine the following, right? You worked so hard all your life to participate in a revolution that would end feudalism and usher humanity into capitalism. And lo and behold, when you arrive in England, what do you see? You see women and children working for 18 hours a day. You see class exploitation at a scale that would, put the feudal landlords and the pharaohs to shame. So what you discover, as a matter of fact, is that the promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which capitalism had promised, has gone sour. Capitalism, far from delivering liberty, equality, and fraternity, as the French revolutionaries had promised, is an impediment to, is a wall, is something that constrains liberty, equality, and fraternity. So Marx began to ask a very simple question, namely, why did the French Revolution fail? Why did the bourgeois democratic revolutions in the 1830s and 1840s fail at bringing liberty, equality, and fraternity to the world? And he began to discover the following, that while a host of changes, political, economic, and cultural, took place in the way we reorganized property relations. For those of you who don't know, property and land was taken away from the church, which was the state at the time, and redistributed. So there was property redistribution at the moment, at the origin of capitalism. So when someone tells you, how can Marxists reorganize property, isn't that fundamentally a flaw or something? Remind them that the birth of capitalism took place precisely as a result of the appropriation of private property from the church and its redistribution in a new way. So changes took place in the way property was reorganized. Power was reorganized. King Louis XIV was guillotined. It was a power exercise. Yet, Marx began to discover through his analysis of political economy, and this is the punchline, that what was missed was class analysis. And specifically, what Marx is going to mean by that term in 1867 is the manner in which, you ready? The surplus is organized by society. And I'm going to say something about that in a moment. All right, guys. I'm now going to dive into, with that framework, hopefully I've tried to give you guys a brief sketch of Marx's life and his major aim. His major aim in life after 1848, to reiterate, is to develop an understanding, A, of what went wrong, and to do this by looking at the economic and political economic framework that gave birth to capitalism. So Marx, you ready, wants to examine capitalism as an economic system. So the book Das Kapital is not about socialism. The book Das Kapital is not about communism. The book Das Kapital is not about the market mechanism. The book Das Kapital is about how capitalism works. And I often say this to people, that regardless of whether you want to destroy capitalism or make money from it, this is a book that you must read, because it's going to teach you, it's going to tell you about the secret of profits. All right, guys. So I'm going to spend the next, the latter half of my presentation on the preface. So I'm going to start with the first volume of Capital, and I'm going to go over the preface. Why? Because the preface is going to teach us some things about the method, i.e. the dialectical method that Marx is going to deploy to write this book. Okay, so here's something that Marx says right at the start of the preface to Capital Volume 1. He says that I presuppose a reader who is willing to learn something new and therefore to think for himself. In other words, Marx wants us to know that this is a living project and by no means complete. Okay, guys, what is the aim of Capital? Why did Marx write this book? Right at the start of Capital Volume 1, in the preface, he says that the ultimate aim of my book, the ultimate aim, the final aim, the overarching aim of this book is to lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society. To lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society. What does that mean? Now, for those of you who are interested in science and physics in particular, you can already tell that this is a very physics kind of a language, right? Laws of motion. Doesn't that remind you of that other person, Sir Isaac Newton? Well, of course it does, because at that point in time, the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, people were really interested in trying to bring about a theoretical framework that would explain most or all of the empirical observations that we were making, right? Okay, so what does this mean then? Marx is going to use a method called the dialectical method of reasoning, which, to cut a long story short, we could do an entire session on philosophy. But for the present purpose, I'm just going to define dialectics as a way of knowing. What does that mean? Well, think about the following. When you make a statement about anything in this world, that the earth is round, that 2 + 2 = 4, that Paris is in France, etc., when you make any analytical claim, I could ask you the follow-up question, how do you know this? And basically, as soon as I ask that question, how do you know what you think you know, I'm in the world of what philosophers call epistemology. Epistemology. What does that mean? An epistemology is a way of knowing, a theory of knowledge. Okay? So dialectics is a way of knowing that accounts for motion. That is to say, dialecticians do not believe in static analysis. Dialecticians believe that an object, in order to be understood, has to be understood in motion. That is to say, if we want to analyze capitalism, we must be open to the idea that what Marx was concretizing in his own time, thinking about in 1867, was industrial England, as I will demonstrate in a couple of slides. And it's entirely possible that you and I may face the task, as I will try to do in session 3, of using the same framework to understand Meta, Amazon, Walmart, etc., etc. In other words, since capitalism as an object of analysis is in motion, is changing, is transforming, is in a state of flux, therefore, in order to explain what's going on, we must have embedded within our analysis, you ready? A flow principle. So here's how we're going to understand capital. Capital is going to be understood as a flow of values, as a transformative process, you ready, in which workers' labor gets transformed into commodities which are sold by the capitalist for money. Wait a minute. Think about it for a second. If a little child, an 8-year-old, asked you, can you please explain why there's rain? How are you going to go about explaining that? Hopefully, if you're honest with this child, you will say that, son or daughter, the way it works is that it's a process. And the process is known as the water cycle. And in doing so, you'll invoke the concept of evaporation and the concept of condensation to explain this idea. That is to say, in order to explain rain, you'll have to explain the entire water process, the water cycle. Similarly, if you were a biologist trying to explain the flow of blood in the human system, you'll say there's this pump called the heart, which pumps the thing, and then there's other mechanisms which filter it, so on and so forth. That is to say, in reality, when human beings have to analyze any object of analysis, they have to account for, if they're honest, the flow that is taking place. In the biologist's case, it may be the flow of blood. In the chemist's case, it might be the flow of organic matter. In the physicist's case, you get the picture. In this particular book, i.e. Capital, Marx is going to look at the flow of three things: the flow of money, the flow of commodities, and the flow of production. And this is what he means when he says that I'm going to try to understand and lay bare the economic laws of motion of capitalism. Just a word of caution here. This by no means implies that Marxism is the same thing as economic determinism. Marxism is an analysis of the material world via the dialectical way of reasoning. And as you know better than I do, reality consists of biological, cultural, political, gendered, all kinds of processes. And if you don't believe me, when young people began to criticize Marx and Engels for being deterministic in the economic sense, Engels wrote this lovely letter to a young student named Bloch in 1890, in which he says something really fascinating. Engels says in 1890, this is 7 years after Marx's death, Engels says, Marx and I are ourselves partly to blame for the fact, look at the humility, guys, we are ourselves partly to blame for the fact that the younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due to it. We had to emphasize the main principles vis-a-vis our adversaries who denied it, and we had not always the time, the place, or the opportunity to give their due to the other elements involved in the interaction. So he's saying that we just didn't have the time to talk about the cultural, the biological, the political, the gendered, all the rest of it. We're human beings. You guys should do this. But when it came to presenting a section of history to make a practical application, it was a different matter, and there no error was permissible. And this is something that he's going to bemoan, and it's an unfortunate fact that stays with us till this day. He says, unfortunately, however, it happens only too often that people think they have fully understood a new theory and can apply it without more ado from the moment they have assimilated its main principles, and even those not always correctly. And I cannot exempt many of the more recent quote-unquote Marxists from this reproach, for the most amazing rubbish has been produced in this quarter too. That's also something to keep in mind when you have conversations with people who describe themselves as Marxists, but their claims and conclusions are often reminiscent of amazing rubbish, to quote Friedrich Engels. Okay, so now right at the start of volume 1, because as you can see, for those of you who've tried to read this book, chapter 1 and especially section 1 provides us with the most theoretical and philosophical difficulty. And Marx, being an empathetic person, reminds his reader of the following in the preface. He says, this is straight from the preface to Capital Volume 1, guys. He says, every beginning is difficult, holds in all the sciences. To understand the first chapter, especially the section that contains the analysis of commodities, will therefore present the greatest difficulty. That which concerns more especially the analysis of the substance of value and the magnitude of value, I have, as much as it was possible, popularized. In the analysis of economic forms, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of use. The force of, you ready? This is a very important word, the force of abstraction. Abstraction must replace both. So here's what Marx is saying, guys. Pay attention. He's saying that in trying to analyze capitalism and the flow of value, I do not have access to a laboratory. I'm going to be using the force of abstraction. Which brings us to the question, what the hell is abstraction? Abstraction is a method of analysis that Marx is going to be using at the simplest level. At the second level, it's an instrument in the toolkit of the dialectician. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible and as clear as possible. Well, the best way of thinking about it, of thinking about abstraction, is to consider a hypothetical vacuum cleaner. Pay attention, guys. Imagine that we have a hypothetical vacuum cleaner that has a very unique property. It has the unique property of sucking out of reality that which makes two things different. And why are we doing this? We're doing this so that we can focus on the similarities and differences between things. Because think about it, all analysis ultimately, or at the face of it at least, boils down to distinguishing between the quantitative and qualitative, you ready, similarities and differences between things. For example, right now in this audience, there are multiple individuals from different countries, from different genders, different identities. We look different, we're in different time zones and all the rest of it. But let's use this hypothetical vacuum cleaner known as abstraction to do the following. You ready? I'm a dialectician, so I can do this. I'm going to abstract from your genders, the way you look, your skin color, your geographical location, the time zone, and all the rest of it. And once I do that, once I abstract from the backgrounds of my audience members, what do I have? 10 seconds ago, I saw Irshad Ahmed, Jay Kumar, Usman Ali, Mariam Zohra, Zainul Abidin. And now, once I have abstracted from these proper nouns, what do I see? Ready? I see Homo sapiens in the abstract. Homo sapiens in the abstract. At this stage of the analysis, Mariam, Zain, Irshad Ahmed, and Tavish Hari are one thing. They're the common concept known as Homo sapien. Now, you could legitimately ask me, or a biologist who came up with this classification, can you show me a Homo sapien in the abstract? And of course, I can't. I can only show you a particular, a concrete individual. I can never show you a Homo sapien in the abstract. Let's do another one. Have you ever seen blue in the abstract? Of course, you're going to say there's no such thing, Professor. We've only seen a blue book, a blue shirt, the blue sky, a blue river, and all the rest of it, right? And you'd be right. In the concrete, I'm using the language Marx is going to use, guys. Pay attention. In the concrete, we have a blue shirt, a blue pen, the blue sky, and all the rest of it. Yet, you and I can agree that the concept called blue or blueness is a rational abstraction. Rational abstraction. In other words, in order to make sense of reality, the dialectician must use, as Marx says, Hegel's force of abstraction. What does that mean? Let's get even more concrete about this. Hegel wrote this amazing book that Lenin believes is critical for anyone who truly wants to understand Marx's Capital. In fact, in his conspectus to this book, The Science of Logic, Lenin has if you look at his notes in the margins, you'll see how he's applying Hegel's Science of Logic to understand Marx's work and Marx's Capital. So this is not a lecture about Hegel, but to cut a long story short, and we could do this in another session, Hegel comes up with a very interesting way of doing this. And again, I risk being formulaic and reductionist over here, but if you can excuse my reductionism for a moment, and if you're willing to let go of it later, I'm going to give you this formulaic kind of a way of thinking about the dialectic. And if I hope that my professors, Rick Wolf, etc., are not watching because they're going to kill me for doing this. Anyway, so here's the idea, guys. Hegel argues that in order to make sense of anything in this world while analyzing the object of analysis, we have to develop a syllogism. A syllogism. What does that mean? A syllogism means that a syllogism consists of a set of relationships between entities. A set of relationships between defined entities. What does that mean? Let me ask you the following question. Is the tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Is it a fruit or a vegetable? Why don't you guys type the answer in the messages so I can have an analysis of what the consensus is on this question. What do you guys think? Is the tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Okay, I can see that most of you are smarty pants and are saying that it's a fruit. And my man Utkarsh is the only dissident in this group. He's the only rebel in an otherwise consensus society who says that it's a vegetable. Well, guys, if you think about it, the answer really depends on who you're talking to and what you want to do with the analysis. If you go to a grocery store, for example, if you go to a Walmart, if you're in the US, or a Tesco, if you're in the UK, or a Punjab grocery store, if you're in Lahore, you'll notice that the way the grocer classifies his tomatoes is not exactly the way the botanist does the thing. If you talk to a botanist, the botanist is going to say, you ready? He's going to say that the tomato is a fruit by virtue of the fact that it has seeds. But if you talk to a nutritionist or a culinary person, they're going to say that, you know what I mean? You may be right. It may be a fruit from the standpoint of the botanist, but from the standpoint of what I want to do in my discipline, i.e. nutrition, is very different. From the standpoint of the nutritionist, the classification used by the botanist is incorrect. In other words, here's what I'm trying to say, guys. The manner in which you classify an object is going to have an impact on your analysis. For example, if my dog, I don't have a dog, but if I did, let's say my dog was, his name was Fido. And if Fido had a stomach bug or a digestive issue, and I went to the veterinary doctor would use, you ready, a theory in which he or she would do the following exercise. Fido is a dog and all dogs are mammals. Fido is the singular or the individual belonging to the particular category called dog, which belongs to the universal category called mammal. In other words, my doctor has just formed a syllogism, a syllogism. To understand and make sense of Fido, you have to understand dogs in general, and to understand dogs in general, you have to understand mammals in general. Now imagine a different doctor who had a different theory of Fido, and he came up with a different syllogism in which he said, Fido is a dog and all dogs are reptiles. I don't know about you, but I would prefer going to the first one to get my dog treated than the latter one. Why? Because I would argue that the latter syllogism is irrational. Irrational. Fido is a mammal, and that's that. Okay, guys. Why am I suddenly giving you a lecture in science? I don't know. Well, here's the reason. It's important, it's critical to understand what Marx says in the preface about capital. Notice, guys, Marx wants to develop a theory of capitalism, capital in general. He wants a theory of mammals. But there is no such thing as a perfect mammal. In reality, I only see mammals in the concrete. I only see individuals in the Homo sapiens species, individuals in the horse species, and so on and so forth. So we have a problem. In order to abstract, the dialectician must have a concrete case study. But the concrete restricts the abstract, and the abstract restricts the concrete. If Marx could live for 10,000 years, he would then analyze the concrete case of Belgium, then the concrete case of Uganda, the concrete case of Somalia, the concrete case of Pakistan. You get the picture. But human beings have finite lives. So here's what Marx did. You ready, guys? This is what he says. He says, the physicist either observes his phenomena where they occur in their most typical form and most free from disturbing influence, or wherever possible, he makes experiments under conditions that assure the occurrence of the phenomena in its normality. In this work, i.e. capital, I have to examine the capitalist mode of production and the conditions of production and exchange corresponding to that mode. Up to the present time, their classic ground is England. That is the reason why England is used as the chief illustration in the development of my theoretical ideas. And then he goes on to say that if the German, by the way, I could replace the word German with Mexican, Pakistani, Ugandan, Somalian, British, French. If, however, the German reader shrugs his shoulders at the condition of the industrial workers of England, or in optimist fashion confronts himself with the thought that in Germany things are not so bad, I must plainly tell him, it is of you that the story is told. So in other words, Marx is saying that while my concrete case is England, the ideas can be generalized to other countries as well. Number one. Okay. A second point, because this is the first lecture, guys, I really want to emphasize the preface as it is, because often when people read Capital, they forget to read the preface. And this is straight from the preface as well. It's critical to understand that Capital and Marxism in general is not a criticism of individuals. So we are not opposed to, as individuals, not opposed to Elon Musk or Warren Buffett or any other individual. We're opposed to the process called capitalism. We're opposed to the process known as the extraction of surplus value. Here's what Marx says. He says, to prevent possible misunderstanding a word. Pay attention, guys. Misunderstanding. I paint the capitalist and the landlord in no sense seen through rose-tainted glasses. But here, individuals are dealt with only insofar as they are, you ready? The personifications of economic categories, embodiments of class relations and class interests. My standpoint from which the evolution of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he socially remains, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. Capital is not a criticism of Elon Musk. Capital is not a criticism of Steve Jobs. Capital is a critique of capitalism. It is a critique of surplus value appropriation by non-producers. Okay. So the method, and this is critical, when you read Capital, please pay attention to the word appearance. Appearance. For those of you who are reading this book in English, whenever the word appearance or presents itself, whenever Marx uses that word, I want you guys to pay a lot of attention, because he's using this in the Hegelian sense. In the Hegelian sense, it appears as if something is like that, but our analysis will reveal that it is actually that. That's what he means. So right in the first paragraph, guys, in chapter 1, Marx is going to say the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense accumulation of commodities. Our analysis must therefore begin with a single commodity. So guys, whenever you're reading Marx, and as soon as you encounter the word appear, pay attention, because what he's saying is that this is the surface appearance. And through Hegelian abstract analysis, we're going to arrive at the essence. Okay. So he says that the method employed in Capital has been little understood. This is in the preface to the German edition, the second edition. So he clearly was frustrated by the fact that a lot of people were reading Capital without appreciating its Hegelian nuances. And that's critical, because he criticizes people who try to develop a non-Hegelian understanding of the problem. So he says, I openly avowed myself the pupil of that mighty thinker Hegel, and even there in the chapter on the theory of value, coquetted with the modes of expression peculiar to him. Okay, the second point I want you guys to understand as students of Capital, as people who want to really, really understand this book. Kindly mute yourself, friends.
Session aja contoh alih tu.
Jay, I think you'll have to
Saya
mute.
17 slide tu, hanya 17 pak.
Asghar Mia. Thank you, Asghar. Okay, so one of the things that I want you to understand, and this is true for all dialectical analysis, guys, is that there must always be, and there will always be, a distinction between the method of presenting something, that is how you teach or present that information, how you write about it so that other people can understand, versus how you yourself arrived at those conclusions. This is true for any scientist, by the way. The way the biologist or the doctor, him or herself, arrives at an analysis of what's going on inside the human body is very different from how he or she is going to explain that to the patient, right? So Marx reminds us that the method of presentation is different from the method of inquiry. He says, and this is from the preface to Capital Volume 1, he says, of course, the method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. The latter has to examine the material in detail, to analyze its different forms of development, to trace out their inner connections. Only after this work is done can the movement be adequately described. Okay, so now with that in mind, I don't want to lose what I've already done, guys. I've argued that Marx's method in Capital is dialectical, and it is Hegelian in the precise sense in which Hegel defines that in the science of logic. So that for readers of Capital, please pay attention, guys, for readers of Capital, you must have the following in your arsenal. you must be able to distinguish between concrete and abstract. Concrete and abstract. What do I mean? In the concrete, I see a blue book, a blue sky, and a blue shirt. But what is common to the blue book and the blue shirt and the blue sky is blueness in the abstract. Okay, let's do another one. What is common to communist production, slave production, feudal production, and capitalist production? They are all production in the abstract, production in general. Stay with me, guys, huh? Marx's aim in Das Kapital is to examine a particular kind of production. Just as, for example, Noah Harari has written a book about a particular kind of mammal known as the Homo sapien. For those of you who don't know, Harari has written this book called Sapiens. So, Sapiens are a book, the book Sapien is a book about a particular kind of mammal known as the Homo sapien. Okay. The book Das Kapital is a particular book about a particular historical mode of production called capitalist production. So, in other words, slavery, communism, feudalism, capitalism have something in common. What is that common? They're all modes of production. So, concept number one. I'm going to define production as the conversion, as the transformation of an input into an output using the agency of human nerves and muscles, i.e., labor. Let me do that again. I take some potatoes and cut them using a knife, fry them using a frying pan, and I converted that input into an output known as French fries. I took Microsoft Word, I took Marx's book, and I converted these two inputs into this presentation that you're seeing on your screen. The conversion of an input into an output using the agency of human labor. For example, the worker converts some wood, some saws, some nails, some paint, some polish, and all the rest of it into a chair. But as you will see next week in a lot more detail, all capitalist production is production, but not all production is capitalist production. Pay attention, guys. All dogs are mammals, but not all mammals are dogs. This is made explicit in this other book that Marx wrote but never chose to publish. It was published in 1927. It's called The Grundrisse. For my friends who know German, my apologies for butchering the pronunciation, but you're going to back me up here when I say that the word Grundrisse means in German groundwork or blueprint. In other words, the book Grundrisse or groundwork or blueprint presents, you ready, the way Marx himself arrived at the conclusion. You understand what I'm saying? The way Marx himself developed the analysis of capitalism, as I said, is a Hegelian way of doing it, in which you go from the general to the singular and the singular to the universal. So, here's a very simple introduction to Marx's way of arriving at capital. You ready, guys? I'm going to do this in 6 simple steps. Like all social scientists, Marx is going to start with assumptions. You guys are critical thinkers. Marx has asked you to critically analyze his work. So I'm going to be presenting these 6 steps to you, and I want you either in the comments or later to tell me if the assumption that is being made is a good assumption or a bad assumption. Is that a deal? You're going to tell me whether Marx's assumptions are good or bad. And they're good in some things, they're bad in some things, okay? Critically analyze. What are we trying to do? We're going to try to develop an understanding of production in general, and we're going to use that understanding to understand production in particular, i.e. capitalist production. You with me? Let's do it. Step one, I'm going to make the assumption that Marx makes in his work, The German Ideology, and then again in Capital. Marx makes a simplifying assumption. You guys are going to tell me whether assumption one is good or not. You ready? His assumption is that real human beings exist. In order to analyze anything about the social totality, we must assume real human beings. What does that mean? That means that unlike Adam Smith and David Ricardo and bourgeois economics today, Marxists are not going to begin with Robinson Crusoe who is stuck on an island. We're not going to imagine a future fantasy world in which human beings are living on Jupiter and trying to live through Elon Musk's fantasy dreams via Mars. We're going to be thinking about real human beings as they exist in their flesh and bones, in their real human activity. Is that a good assumption or a bad assumption? Here's what Marx says. He says, the premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can be made only in the imagination. These are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions under which they live, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. Thus, these premises can be verified in a purely empirical way. The first premise of all human history is the existence of living human individuals. So I'm going to put this in the chat for those of you who can't see the slides. Assumption one is real human beings exist. Is this a good assumption or a bad assumption? Give me a thumbs up if you think this is a good assumption. In order to analyze human society, you and I as analysts must make the assumption that real human beings exist. Thus, if you now ask me the following question, what is the mode of production on Pluto or Jupiter? I'm sorry, my analysis is unable to do that. I'm just going to say, I'm really sorry, I do not know how to analyze fantasy. Real human beings exist. Step one. In order to exist as real human beings, they must consume goods and services. I hope that you guys have had a chance to have your dinner or lunch or breakfast, depending on where you're located. I hope that you're well clothed. I hope that you have access to the basic necessities that enable you to exist as a human being. So in other words, in order for step one to be true, in order for real human beings to exist, these real human beings must eat, drink, have shelter and clothing. They must consume goods and services. Is this a good assumption or a bad assumption? To exist, human beings must consume bread, eggs, vegetables, etc., etc. Human beings must have a roof on their head. Human beings must have clothes. They must have a mode of transport, etc., etc., etc. In order to exist as Homo sapiens, we must consume goods and services. Step two. But to consume goods and services, step three, have to be produced. Have you ever consumed an omelette that has never been fried? Have you had the chance to wear a shirt that has never been stitched? Have you walked on a road that has never been built? Of course, I can tell by your laughters that you cannot consume what has not been produced. Is this a good assumption or a bad assumption? Good assumption. In order to, let's do it again. Step one, real human beings exist. Step two, to exist means, implies, it follows that to exist, human beings must consume goods and services. Step three, without production, there can be no consumption. Step three. But production was defined, remember? Bad assumption? Shannon, why do you think it's a bad assumption? How can you consume without producing? Type it in the message. I really want to know. If you think that, okay, we can have this conversation later. I'm going to continue with the idea that I'm trying to present. Yes, nature is the producer of use values, absolutely right. But to make them, to turn the coconut or the orange into orange juice, human labor has to be performed. So indeed, nature is the secret of wealth as well, but to turn it into orange juice, I must take from nature the input, i.e. oranges, and then apply human labor to it to convert it into the orange juice. Otherwise, the oranges are going to go rotten in nature, as they do in many apples do in Kashmir, in places where there is no market access. Anyway, we'll return to that discussion later. For now, I'm going to continue with Marx's assumption. He says that there can be no consumption of goods and services without the act of production. Because production is defined as the conversion of an input into an output using the agency of human nerves and muscles. Step 4. This implies something fascinating, guys. If you look at economic history, the past or the present, you'll notice something fascinating. You'll notice that some people in every society use their nerves and muscles, i.e. perform labor, to convert the orange into orange juice, the wheat into bread, the wood into chair, the potatoes into French fries. Some people do that, while others don't. Let me do that again. In every society, past, present, and future, we see two kinds of people: those who perform labor and produce goods and services. They make the wheat, they make the bread, they produce the cars, they make the roads, they construct the buildings, all the rest of it, while others do not. Now, you may immediately have guessed that, well, this set includes the list of dependents. For example, every decent sort of society has a system in which they argue, at least from the ethical standpoint, that children and the elderly should be exempt from labor. Okay? So let's do the following. Let's divide these individuals into two groups. I'm going to call the people in group A, i.e. the people who perform labor, who use their nerves and muscles to turn an input into an output. I'm going to call them group A, as opposed to people in group B who don't. Make sense? Now, for those of you who've taken a basic course in mathematics, I'm going to use set theory here. I'm going to say, let's subtract from set B the list of dependents. Let's subtract the children and the disabled and the dependent elderly population from this set. Does this leave set B empty? No. As you can see, set B is still what we call a non-null set or a non-empty set. That is to say, set B still has individuals who are able-bodied. They're not children, they're not elderly, they're not disabled, they hear just fine, they speak well, they have nerves and muscles that are functioning, yet they are exempt from labor. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. Marx says, why? It follows now that since the people in group A, i.e., the people who make the shirts, who make the bread, who make the food, who make the buildings, blah, 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 the people who do these things obviously consume only a part of it. And given the fact that people in group B, the non-performers of labor, are alive and kicking, it follows that people, you ready guys? This is the concept number 2. People in group A produce a surplus, a surplus. So let's define this term. A surplus is defined as the product, the part of the product that is beyond necessary labor. What does that mean? The part of the product that the worker produces and consumes him or herself, Marx is going to call this necessary labor. And the part of the product that is beyond that, that is more than that, Marx is going to call it surplus labor. For example, to use a very brute kind of an example, I invite all of you to my place. I don't, but hypothetically, huh? I invite all of you for a lovely dinner at my place in which I cook for you. I use my nerves and muscles to make 50 chapatis. I eat 2 of them and distribute the latter 48 to my students. The 2 chapatis that I made in this case would be necessary labor. But remember, I made 50. So the 48 in this case would be surplus product. You with me, guys? Necessary versus surplus product. Now, in this case, I am the one who made the surplus, and I am the one who decides to distribute it to you. Should one of you insult or humiliate me in this process, I will say, please leave the premises. This implies that I have the power over the surplus and you do not. By virtue of the fact that I made the surplus, in this case, I myself made decisions about it. But every society has to ask this precise question. Because we have a surplus, I'm arriving at the end of the slides, guys. Please pay attention, huh? Because we have a surplus, and this is a fundamental question that Marx is going to be dealing with. Every society, past, present, and future, has to answer 3 questions. Number 1, who produces the surplus? Number 2, who makes decisions about it? Is it the worker himself or herself because he or she made it? Is it a team of workers because they made it collectively? Or is it someone else? And if it is someone else, why the hell is it someone else? Why is that person in charge of what I made? Who gets to make the decisions about it? And finally, who gets distributions from it? Because imagine, if someone else I'm making these chapatis, and as soon as I make them, someone else dives in, jumps in, appropriates it from me, and starts giving it to other people. He or she gives a part of it to the government, and they call it taxes. He or she gives a part of it to the merchant and calls it the merchant's profit. He or she gives a part of it to the banker and calls it the interest. He or she gives a part of it to the unproductive worker. He or she throws a part of it in the oceans. But remember, I made 50 chapatis. I ate 2 of them, and the surplus of 48, which I produced, someone else is making decisions about it. Marx says that this is critical. The person who makes the decisions about the surplus is going to distribute them in a manner that maximizes his or her private economic and political interest. Here's what Marx is going to say in chapter 9. This is what I've assigned for next week, so please read this carefully. He's going to say that the essential difference between the various economic forms of society, between, for instance, a society based on slavery and one based on wage labor, lies only, only, lies only in the mode in which this surplus is in each case pumped out, extracted from the actual producer, the laborer. Marx is going to say in chapter 9 of Capital, volume 1, he's going to make this as explicit as possible. He's going to say that the difference between slavery, feudalism, communism, capitalism, etc., lies in the manner in which the surplus is pumped out of the person who made the 50 chapatis. And he says, when we look at the real history of human beings, we find 5 broad ways of doing this. This list is by no means exhaustive, but he says, broadly speaking, we can identify 5 variants of how to answer question 5. Who produces the surplus? Who makes decisions about it? So he says we find 5 ways of doing this. The first is the most obvious one. And by the way, human beings have been around for about, the scientist tells us, 200,000 years. And 192,000 years, out of those 200,000 years, we did this in the following way. Remember, 192 divided by 200. Do the mathematics and you'll realize that that's a very high percentage. For most of human history, the workers who made the surplus themselves democratically made decisions about what to do with it. That is to say, a community of workers, the community of people who use their nerves and muscles to produce an output, that community, the word communist is derived from the word community. The community, which community? The community of direct producers themselves make decisions about the surplus. Has that happened for 192 out of 200 years? 192,000 divided by 200,000, calculate the percentage. So when someone asks you, where has communism ever worked or existed, remind them, throughout human history. Number 1. Number 2, a second way of doing this is that instead of having a team of individuals producing the product, we have an individual. For example, my dentist runs this private self-employed firm where he produces a surplus and he himself, as a self-employed individual, himself makes decisions about the surplus. Notice that in the communist or the self-employed category 1 and 2, the worker or the set of workers who produce the surplus themselves make decisions about it. In the slave way of doing this, the person, the direct producer, does not make decisions about the surplus. He or she belongs as a person to someone else who is known as the master. In feudalism, or in serfdom more precisely, the serf is not the property of the slave master, but his or her mobility, movement is confined, and by virtue of that fact, the serf produces the surplus and the landlord makes decisions about it. And finally, the system that you and I are going to be studying in the next 3 weeks, the system that Marx wrote this book about, capitalism. It's a way in which the workers produce the surplus, and that surplus is sold in the market and converted into a surplus value. The capitalist or the board of directors of Alphabet and Amazon and Apple make decisions about it, and the workers receive a wage in the form of necessary labor. So in this precise sense, slavery, serfdom, and wage labor are identical. This is why Marx is continuously going to remind you by referring to wage labor as wage slavery. He's reminding us that while in appearance it may seem that you and I are free individuals, he's going to say you're still peasants, you're still slaves, you're still bonded, you're still unfree. He's going to say that you, me, and the 99% of humanity who live off of wages, salaries, and tips are being exploited by the 1% who live off profits, rent, and interest. Marx is going to demonstrate that profit, rent, and interest are distributions of class exploitation, the appropriation of a surplus by non-producing members of society. Final slide, guys, and I promise you I'm going to stop now. Marx divides this project into 6 volumes. Volume 1, he's going to show you from next week onwards how the hell is a surplus produced. Volume 2 is going to say, how is this surplus value circulating? How is it flowing in the veins of the merchants and the banks and the stock market and all the rest of it? And in volume 3, he's going to develop an understanding of the macroeconomic system as a whole and show you why this disease called capitalism results in volatility, unemployment, crises, depressions, recessions, suicides, and all the rest of it. And in volumes 4, 5, and 6, which were published, by the way, for those of you who are interested, by Karl Kautsky from Germany, these are historical volumes in which Marx is going to walk you through the history of the concept. These are called theories of surplus value. All right, guys. Unfortunately, I've taken a lot of time, and I'm going to start with some of these themes next week. I'm going to leave you with the following thought experiment. Consider the following. Throughout volume 1 of Capital, Marx is going to make an assumption, and it's a good assumption. At this stage of the analysis, in volume 1, Marx wants you to understand that capitalism is premised on class exploitation. So he's going to make a simplifying assumption, which he's going to eventually relax in volume 2 and 3. And the assumption at this stage of the analysis is that values and prices are identical. In other words, the market is a place where equal exchange takes place. So far from those people who say capitalism is a system of markets and we criticize markets thereafter, after reading Capital, none of you are going to say that capitalism is the same thing as the market mechanism, because you've already lost the intellectual battle, my friend. Marx is going to argue that markets are, in his words, Eden of equality. $50 worth of stuff can only be exchanged for $50 worth of stuff in the market. It is only in the sphere of production where inequality is being bred. So he's going to say that if you want to look for class exploitation, stop looking at the market and go inside, his words, the hidden abode of production. So remember now, as you will see in session 3, what you see in front of you right now, hopefully if the slides are working, is called the circuit of capital. Here, Marx is going to literally walk you through what's going on inside the factory. The capitalist starts with a sum of money M. He or she goes into the market and buys some non-labor inputs. These non-labor inputs are worth 50 rupees or $50. And then the capitalist goes into the market and buys labor power worth 50 rupees or $50, so that the cost of doing this was $100. This results in the production of a new commodity called a chair, which is sold in the market for $150. As you can see, my friends, if equality is taking place at all ends of this circuit, $100 exchanged hands with 100 at the start of this circuit, and 150 worth of chair changed hands with 150 worth of money. Yet 100 is not equal to 150. Something happened in the interim period. Something happened in this box called production, such that, you ready, 100 became 150. And when that happens, this is the punchline. When that happens, when money is used to make more money, we say that money has acted as capital. So I'm going to leave you with that definition. Capital is value that is in the process of expanding. Capital is self-expanding value. Capital is that majestic and mystical thing that automatically converts 100 into 150, 150 into 300, 300 into 3,000, 3,000 into 3 trillion, such that if you simulate this game for 200 years, in 2024, 62 individuals have more wealth than half the planet. So if you think that we must explain these facts using analysis, join me next week in trying to understand the mystery of surplus value. All right, guys, I'm going to stop here, and hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss some of these things and analyze them in slightly more detail. Thank you.